Thank you, everyone, for joining us here at the 4-Day Workweek panel. It's our final policy panel of the day here at Statehouse Futures 3. Don't tell the other panels, but this is my favorite panel. I'm so excited here. The length of the workday and the work week has changed at various points throughout American history. Before the Civil War, the word weekend didn't even exist. There was just the Sabbath. Word weekend didn't exist until the 1870s. And in 1933, the Senate passed a 30-hour work week bill, failed to pass the House. 5 years later, a 40-hour work week bill did. Think about how much different our lives would be if they had the votes in the House in 1933. And now we have a 40-hour work week. So it's pretty arbitrary. But by the mid-20th century, many experts thought the work week would shorten even more. John Maynard Keynes thought technological advancement would lead to a 15-hour work week. Senate subcommittee in 1965 said 14-hour work week by 2000. We're now 23 years after that. And my favorite to kick us off, in 1956, a certain politician stated that a shorter work week was, inevitable within our time, and that's fine. That politician's name, Richard Nixon. Since COVID, people are starting to wake up to the idea of, hey, maybe it's time to free up some time for some other things that matter, not just leisure, but also family work, care work, community work, religious participation, entrepreneurship, and more. And there is now a global 4-day work week with no decline in pay movement that has reached our shores. And today we have one of the leading experts on the 4-day work week around the world, advising 4-day work week campaigns around the world and doing amazing studies on it. We also have a legislator who is one of the first state legislators to bring this idea to his state house. So without further ado, here is one of my favorite scholars in America, an economist and sociologist at Boston College, Juliet Schor, who's going to share a bit about this idea of the 4-day work week and what she's found in her research. And I'm going to bring up her slides.
Great. Well, thank you, Pete. It's wonderful to be here. Really excited about this session. And I just want to start by noting, how much excitement there is about the 4-day week in the United States and around the world. So that's the first point. I think it's a large part due to the pandemic, but also issues in the labor market. And I hope that some of it has to do with the fact that the kind of research I'm going to show you today is starting to convince people that a 4-day week is something that's not just desirable, which I think the vast majority of people believe, but is actually feasible, practical, can work for business as well as working for employees. Next slide, please. So a little bit of the backstory on...
Next slide coming one second.
Great, thanks.
Okay.
The backstory on the work that I've been doing with colleagues since 2021. There's an organization coming out of New Zealand called 4-Day Week Global, which now is truly global. And it was started by a businessman named Andrew Barnes, who read an article which convinced him that maybe he could reduce the work week at his company, which was called Perpetual Guardian. He developed what he calls the 100-80-100 model, which is people get 100% of the pay. They have to work for 80% of the time, but they do 100%. They have 100% of the output or their productivity. And that's what makes it feasible for businesses. They're not losing productivity because people are just working more efficiently. And so he and his partner, Charlotte Lockhart, started an organization called 4-Day Week Global. We began recruiting companies into what we call trials or pilots that go for 6 months and are preceded by 2 months of coaching and onboarding in which the companies figure out how to reorganize work in order to allow people to be as productive in 4 days as 5. So the requirements for participating are pretty minimal. You have to maintain pay at 100%, and you have to give a meaningful reduction in hours. The vast majority are going from 5 to 4, so they're giving people a full day off. Next slide, please. So I have been the lead researcher for these trials since the beginning, and these are the kinds of data that we are tracking. We are tracking data from employers. They're giving us individual metrics. We're looking at their revenue, retention, absenteeism, energy use, because a 4-day week, we believe, is an important climate enhancing policy, reducing commuting. We have an employee survey. We survey people at 4 points at the beginning of the trial, 3 months in, 6 months in, and then after a year. And it's a pretty extensive questionnaire that looks at their work experiences, well-being, energy use, demographics. Midpoint, we look at well-being outcomes and get data on what people are doing on the off day, and then pre and post-trial interviews, not for all of the trials, but for a good number of them. Next slide, please. So what I'm going to show you today are some results that are not yet out. They are an amalgamation of all of the companies in the US and Canada that have gone through our trials, and we are now approaching our 8th trial, and we have hundreds of companies and thousands of employees who have been part of them. The results that I'm going to show you today, as I said, are for US Canada, but I can tell you they're almost identical to results that we're finding in other places in the world, like Australasia, the UK, Ireland, and we have trials going on now in South Africa. We're starting one in Portugal, or Portuguese has started, Brazil. A German trial is going to be starting. So a lot of small companies in the trials, which is not surprising because the big ones don't need to join somebody else's trial. But we give, almost free coaching and free research. But we are getting more and more bigger companies. They are in a range of areas. Professional services and marketing is the biggest, but we have a good number of nonprofits, IT, we have construction, we have manufacturing, we have banks, we have law firms, we have healthcare, we have pretty much everything. And just because people ask about it, in this trial, a good number of these companies were fully remote, but many of them were not. And we have companies like, we have a brewery, and a fish and chip shop, and manufacturing. So those will be all zero remote work in those. And then, of course, we have remote. So next slide, very fast. I just wanted to let everyone know these findings are embargoed until next week, so please don't share them. Next slide. So what did we find? Well, first of all, how is it going for the companies? Companies are rating these trials very, very highly on a scale of, it says 1 to 10. It's actually 0 to 10. The overall impact is an 8.7. And they are rating their ability to attract new employees at an 8.7, productivity and performance at a 7.7. And we track revenue. So over the course of the trial, 15% revenue increases. We also ask employees about the likelihood that how seriously they're considering leaving their jobs. That fell by a third in these companies. And probably the most important piece of evidence about the trials is the fact that among these, no companies said that they were planning to return to a 5-day schedule. So 89% said they're definitely or planning on continuing, the remaining 11% leaning toward continuing. And of all the hundreds of companies that we've studied, there are really only a handful who have either stopped the trial or are not continuing. Next slide, please. Employees are also extremely happy. Average rating is a 9.1, 95% want to continue. Big impact here is employee self-reports, which soar. People also feel more in control. They were able to reduce their work time. And when we asked them about how valuable the 4-day week is to them, so we asked them what kind of a salary requirement would they have for going back to a 5-day week. a third of them say they need between 25 and 50% more. 12% say they need more than 50%, and 14% say no amount of money would induce them to go back to 5 days. Next slide, please. So health and well-being go up a lot. Almost 7 in 10 had reduced burnout, 40% less stress, 60% decline in negative emotions, 45% less fatigue, 40 fewer sleep problems. We're finding that sleep is really important in driving these well-being outcomes. Anxiety went down for 40% of the sample. Next slide, please. Key findings here. So here what I want to emphasize, and I've talked to you about some of these already, is the new findings that we have, which is what happens between month 6 and month 12. So the basic finding is that for almost everything, the positive aspects of the experience get more positive. So it deepens. People sort of lean into it more and figure out better how to do it. So weeks worked, hours worked per week go down. Sometimes it takes people a little bit of time to get into that shorter work week pattern. So that continued to fall. Work intensity didn't go up. So this is a really important thing. This is not a speed up program. It's reorganizing the work to take inefficient things off people's plates, to make systems work better, to change the meetings culture, to reduce distractions. And we could talk more about any of this, but the key point is that it's not because people are just working faster. It's not a speed up. And we can see that in the work intensity variable, which number one doesn't go up in the first 6 months and then even fell in the next 6 months. Here you see the burnout findings, basically big decline in burnout, little bit of movement back on that, but really trivial. Next slide, please. Physical health improves, so it continued to improve in the second 6 months. Mental health continues to improve, although these are not statistically significant, but the point is that findings don't regress. Life satisfaction stays the same. Job satisfaction falls a little bit, still higher than at baseline. Work-life balance improves even more, and overall experience stays the same. So I think that was my last slide. I don't want to take up too much time. Oh yes, one last thing, environmental outcomes. Fewer people commuting by car, and it's really interesting to us that this is happening, and also days of commuting by car decline, in part, even as more people are going back into the office. So by giving people more time, it allows them to have a more leisurely pace of transport, which is one of the things we were hoping for. And then we ask about environmentally friendly activities, and 40% of them say they did more of them during the trial than they were doing at the beginning of the trial. So now I will stop. Thank you very much, and I look forward to our conversation.
Thank you so much, and please keep dropping questions into the chat. If you have any questions for Dr. Schor, we'll get to them at the end after we get to our other panelists. Thank you so much, Dr. Schor, for this amazing research, and research that all of us as kind of employees kind of know in our bones already, but it's always good to put numbers on it. Now, the question is, we're not just a general work-life org here. You know, this conference is about, and we at Deepen, the Democracy Policy Network, are about policies, and especially state policies that state legislators can fight for. So the question is, how do we take findings like these and this goal of what a 4-day work week is, and bring it to state policy? And what's amazing is here on this panel, we have a delegate who has done just that, and proposed one of the first state policy pushes for pushing towards a 4-day work week and doing what the government can to help nudge employers towards this. And when he submitted this, it went totally viral. Atlantic articles, all piece of Maryland media, CNN hits and the like, and a lot of friendly messages from constituents about excitement about this bill. So without further ado, the man behind the bill that did this from Maryland, from the Maryland legislature, Delegate Vaughn Stewart, to tell a little bit about the story of how you got interested in this and how the fight for it in your state house went.
Absolutely. Well, thank you very much, Pete. I appreciate the opportunity to be here. It's an honor to be here with Juliet and you both, and to participate in this, what I'm sure was an extraordinary day of panels, but I have to admit I wasn't here for, but I'm sure everyone loved it. So really this idea actually originally came from, Pete and Deepen. I mean, I'd always heard about the fight for reduced work hours throughout American history. It really is kind of one of the hallmark battles, not only of the left, but of the labor movement. And it's something that has more or less been dormant among policymakers for decades. And so I tip my hat to Deepen to sort of helping me resurrect this idea. And our initial thought was, our initial kind of decision point was, do we want this to be a nudge? Do we want this to be an incentive for employers to experiment with this idea? Or do we want it to be a mandate? The two previous pieces of legislation that had been introduced on this topic, one at the federal level and one in California, had gone the mandate route. They had essentially said that past 32 hours, employers would be required to pay overtime. So that's a heavy-handed way to implement a 4-day work week. It certainly would work. Obviously, you'd have to work through the amendment process about which kind of companies were exempted and when, but that would certainly be a dramatic change that I think would make a material, tangible improvement in a lot of working people's lives. However, we also had to consider the point that we want a bill to pass. Certainly, I would have probably gotten a lot of press and a lot of buzz, even if we had just put in a bill that would have required companies to pay overtime over 32 hours. But we wanted to move the ball forward a little bit more. We wanted to put something in place that actually had a shot to pass the Maryland legislature. And for a lot of people, you may assume that because Maryland is a very blue state, we must, of course, have a very liberal, very progressive, very forward-thinking legislature. Unfortunately, on a lot of issues, this is not necessarily the case. And even though we have a Democratic supermajority, and we actually now have a Democratic trifecta, there are a lot. We figured there would be a lot of people who were hesitant about this idea broadly, but would especially be virulently opposed if it required a mandate on any businesses, because the businesses have extremely powerful lobbyists. They're very charismatic. They're good at what they do. They're compensated accordingly, and they would have come out of the woodwork to oppose a bill like that. So that was the first decision we made, was we want this to be an incentive. So what does the incentive look like? What we initially went with is a bill that cost $1 million, a mandated appropriation of $1 million, $250,000 put aside for administrative costs, and $750,000 in tax credits for companies who are willing to, number one, meaningfully reduce hours without reducing pay, and number two, record their data in some way and report it back to Maryland's Department of Labor. If they were willing to do that, they would get some portion of that $750,000. Now, we kind of left it to the agency to decide how many people would be part of the pilot, what would be the per company amount of money that they would receive. And ultimately, we hope that at the end of this sort of 5-year pilot program, we would have a lot of data that suggests that not only this idea works in Scotland, UK, but it can work in Scotland, Maryland. And not only does it work in Berlin, Germany, but it can work in Berlin, Maryland, on the Eastern Shore. And we knew that if we had that sort of proof of concept with even just a handful of companies, then taking some other additional legislative steps would be way easier. So we initially, I would say overall, the reaction to this bill dropping, and we didn't put out a single press release, was absolutely overwhelming from all corners. I had more press attention and media inquiries about this bill than I've had all of my pieces of legislation that I've put in the last 5 years as a legislator combined, easily. And for my colleagues, the reception really on both sides of the aisle was mostly positive. I had a lot of people even tell me that their kids had heard about this and were telling them they needed to vote for it or co-sponsor it. And after I had several local media hits, now state legislators in Maryland, I don't know about your state, but we're hardly famous. No one knows who we are. But I actually had 2 people stop me on the streets of Annapolis who I did not know, who were not involved with the state government, over the course of the legislative session, saying they saw me on the local news, and that one said they were cheering for me for the bill and keeping their fingers crossed. The other actually said they were praying for me and praying that the bill would pass because it would make such a big impact in their lives. So the response was overwhelming. But while most people sort of immediately were drawn to this idea and thought that the idea of doing an incentive rather than a mandate was sort of clever, there was some pushback. So it happened on a few different levels. First, I would say there was the power players in Annapolis. A lot of times their reaction was what I would consider, or what I would characterize as, just old school. And it was not necessarily a specific policy criticism of the bill, more as kind of just this vague sense of, this is a weird concept. I grew up at a time when we were all supposed to work really hard. And now you're telling me that we should actually be thinking about ways to cut work. That kind of goes against my sensibilities. This is weird and strange. Let's not do this right now. The second reaction from sort of the more arch conservative members of the Republican Party was, this is an obvious Trojan horse. You're trying to do this as an incentive now and try to make this seem like it's business friendly. But really, we know that once you get your nose under the camel's tent, then you're going to push a mandate bill in a few years. We know you, Vaughn. We know you're a crazy left winger. This is just a matter of time. And then finally, there was sort of a budget hawk response from both parties, which is, why should we spend money on this at a time when there was sort of fiscal uncertainty and maybe recession clouds on the horizon? Of all the things we could spend money on, why $750,000 on this? And the sort of corollary to that argument was, shouldn't companies be doing this already? If the data is so overwhelmingly positive, as I attested, and as you just saw in the presentation, why don't companies just do this already? And of course, I had to argue that inertia is powerful. Change is hard. A lot of companies know, even if they see their peers making this change, business owners would come to me and say, we're just nervous about it. We're not sure how it pencils out. And maybe they just need a little bit of a nudge. But what came out of this actually is the committee chairs basically came to me and said, we're willing to pass the bill. The idea is good enough, and we like you enough that we'll be willing to do it, but we want to gut it, and we want to make it just about 4 10-day hour days rather than an actual reduction in the hours of the work week. What do you think? And I said, I don't love that. What if we did like a study of companies that some of them did 4 10s and some of them did 4 8s, and then maybe we could compare and contrast, and they weren't budging. So I decided instead to withdraw the bill rather than have it voted down or gutted in an amendment. And instead I worked with the committee chairman of the budget committees to put language in the budget. This is something that Maryland does. I don't know if other states do this, but essentially when you give money to agencies, you can tell them to study something. And so we told the Department of Labor that as part of a prerequisite for us funding them in the fiscal year, that they needed to study this and essentially study the feasibility of bringing it to Maryland, the study of what carrots we would need to give to companies to make it work, and the study of the Department of Labor's capacity to provide technical assistance. Because one of the big takeaways, maybe actually the major takeaway from the legislative session, especially to all of you policymakers out here, if you don't listen to anything else I say, one tip I have is, I don't think the tax credit thing really worked. Because I think the criticism was essentially that unless you make it a ton of money, way more money than what we were proposing, it would not make enough of an impact to actually induce any employers to do anything, especially because we didn't know how many ways we were splitting the $750,000. So because it was such a trivial amount of money, it wouldn't have actually had an incentive effect. We could have, of course, increased it, but then we run into the fiscal considerations that we had before. So in talking to a lot of business owners, both during the session and since then, I actually had a really exciting meeting in a very Republican county, had their Chamber of Commerce meeting virtually a few weeks ago, probably the reddest county in the state. The Chamber of Commerce, they invite me to speak to them about this. I kind of thought I was going into the lion's den, but they loved it. To a person, they were super excited about this idea, and they want to testify in Annapolis next time in favor of it. But what they and so many other people told me is, make this bill not about tax credits. If you really want to induce employers to take this plunge, make it about technical assistance, because that's really what they need. And so moving forward, what we're thinking about doing is requiring the Department of Labor to either contract with a group or hire someone in-house to essentially hold businesses' hands through the process of making this transition, and then also helping them share the data. We're thinking that after talking to a lot of businesses, big and small, kind of across the spectrum from the blue to white collar divide, it seems like everything, the thing that most people agree would actually affect employer behavior is if they knew that someone at the Department of Labor had their back, and they could go to them for no charge to walk them through this process, walk them through the logistics of, which meetings should they cut? What part of their day is expendable? And so that's essentially the moving forward what we're focused on. We've got a Department of Labor report coming out that'll hopefully have some even more ideas of what the next step is going to be. That report is going to come out crucially prior to next legislative session. So my Senate sponsor, her name is Senator Shelley Heddleman. She's been awesome and super supportive of this as well. We're going to take a look at that report in December, craft some legislation in response, but I would strongly expect it to look something like technical assistance for businesses to make this leap. I'm hopeful that this will make Maryland the national leader, sort of cement our status as the national leader on this topic. And I'm hopeful that ultimately we can start moving the ball forward to a future that's better for employees, of course, employers, as the data suggests, and as Pete crucially mentioned, better for society as well. Because I think if folks have a little bit extra more time in their day, that means that's more care that they can provide to their loved ones, more friends they can forge, more organizations they can join, more societal fabric they can rebuild, more elections they can participate in. And so I think this is a really revolutionary idea that we can get the ball rolling with, and that every state could do with a relatively simple bill. And again, it's awesome to be here, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Delegate Stewart, for the story of your journey advocating for supporting 4-day work weeks in Maryland. For anyone who has questions for Dr. Schor, Delegate Stewart, please drop them in the chat. One other thing is, if they're over in the chat right next to it, you'll see at the top there's a thing called polls. If you go over to that tab on the right, you can indicate that you are interested in championing this in your state or interested in learning more. And that'll get us your name and email so that we can get in touch with you to share more info about this and help you be able to get in touch with Delegate Stewart or Dr. Schor to get resources, ask for tips and advice, and learn more. So please go over there before the end of the session. We're going to jump into questions. One thing I'll just add for this is, it seems kind of weird that it's this dance between all these different entities. Like, any firm can decide to do 4-day work week, but then we have the government. Then you know, Delegate Stewart saying Chamber of Commerce is interested in this. What's really interesting is, a century ago when we fought for the 5-day work week, it was the exact same dance. It was, if you look into the history of it, it is rabbis advocating for Saturdays off. It's Henry Ford saying that letting his workers have a day off gives them more time to drive cars and buy his cars. It's labor unions going on strike for 4-day work, and it's the government eventually stepping in. So it's, with something like this, it is a dance between culture, voluntary choices, interest by businesses, and the government stepping in policy. And the whole goal is, we just need that momentum started, and we hope you can play your role as state leaders. For Dr. Schor, you know, we've heard the story in Maryland. Have you heard about other bills? I'm sure they're all reaching out to you to advise in other states and even in other countries that you want to add to this story to, you know, for the audience who's interested in how to bring it to their state. You're on mute. You got to click on mute.
Sorry about that. Yes, there's a lot going on in lots of places. It was really great for me to hear Delegate Stewart's presentation, because I was unaware of what's happening now on the issue of technical assistance, which is really interesting. And I think he is yet again a pioneer here, because it's the first time I've heard of a bill that's, or, you know, a potential bill that's really focusing on that. I think that makes a lot of sense. So there are bills in other states. My own state of Massachusetts, we have a bill which is very similar to the original Maryland bill. The financing is a little bit different, but it is a tax credit, same kind of idea. Department of Labor would be running a study to figure out the impacts of this on Massachusetts businesses. Bills have been introduced in California. I think there's something brewing in New York, Hawaii. There are a couple of places where you're seeing 4-day bills that are really more those 410s, which are a really different animal. And I really applaud Delegate Stewart for holding the line against the 410s, even though many people like them, but you won't see anything like the level of well-being improvements that we saw. And you won't get the efficiencies with the 410s. The 4-day week is, I like to think of it as a forcing mechanism for productivity. And around the world, there's a lot happening. There are trials in Portugal and Spain going on. most likely starting. Scottish government has announced one. Most likely something going to happen in Wales. The United Arab Emirates has moved toward a 4-day week. And someone in the chat asked about schools. They just released a big report on the impact of going to 4 days in their whole education system. The Japanese government has encouraged businesses to go to four days, and you know so there's a lot. One exciting thing to me, because the labor union participation in the US has been very minimal compared to some other places, but the big German union, IG Metall, is going to put the 4-day week into its bargaining demands in the fall for its steel workers, which is a huge bargaining unit for that. So I think that's going to sort of open up, I think, a lot more labor pressure coming, at least from Europe.
That's wonderful. One question we've gotten in the chat, and I think is important to raise, is one of the questions with the 4-day work week is the divide between wage and salary work, which really changes the way you think about like the amount, your work week. And so a lot of what we call, you know, the 5-day work week in the US is, you know, a cultural thing for salary workers that you work 5 days. But then for wage workers, a lot of people who are getting wages are like, why are you trying to cut my hours? You're calling that a progressive policy. But one of the big fights here is that it's a lowering of the work week with no change in pay. For salaried workers, it's your same salary while you have a lower work week. For wage workers, that will involve lower hours, but an increase in your wage for that to work. Dr. Schor or Delegate Stewart, you know, Delegate Stewart, if you want to speak to how that divide was kind of navigated in your advocacy, or Dr. Schor in your research, anything you want to speak to of that kind of wage versus salary divide and how that plays out in this cause.
Sure, I'm happy to take a crack at it first. So this is a really important question because it really gets to the heart of the political feasibility of pushing this idea at all. If this is only confined in the minds of, for example, policymakers as this idea that's just for white collar people, it's just for college graduate, it's just something for people that have basically been the winners of the economy for the last 40 years, now they get another benefit. And the people that have been on the bottom getting tread on through the pandemic, you know, essential workers, et cetera. Now here's another nice thing that's going to be going to college graduates that they won't be able to go to benefit from. If that's how this either plays out or is sold or is thought to be, or it's expected to play out, then it's going to make these bills way, way harder to pass. And I think it's going to therefore make our transition to a world with more leisure time slower. And so I think it's crucial that this is felt across that blue to white collar spectrum. And so what we try to pitch it, first of all, in my advocacy, I made clear to my colleagues that this is something, as Dr. Schor mentioned, that's been tried and has been successful in industries that are not just your typical kind of email job, remote work environment. This has been something that has been studied, maybe not as extensively as sort of your typical kind of white collar job or tech job, but it is something that's been tried and it can work just as well in those environments. And especially if people are on their feet all the time or working with their hands, then something like an increased sleep schedule could actually be even more impactful for them. So that's something that I made clear to people, that this is not something we were just targeting a one demographic. We actually wanted to make sure that if there is a trial at the state level, that there is a broad cross section of the types of businesses and industries that are included, so that we can study that. Now, I do think that, you know, for salary workers, there will be some education involved to make you realize, Pete, as you said, that it would be an increase in their hourly pay. Employers may be more reluctant to do that. And so for a model like ours, where we want to provide technical assistance, maybe we'll have less buy-in from employers with wage earners. Maybe that's the case. And if that's the case, then we're going to have to work around that. We're going to have to figure out a way to maybe provide them even more inducement to be part of this, so that we can get even more data about how this works across all industries. And I'm sure Dr. Schor will tell us that there's already some data, but I know in Maryland, a lot of people want to see it apply in Maryland. They want to see it work in Maryland, and they want to see it work in industries like manufacturing and the service sector, to know that this is going to have broad effects. In order for that to happen, maybe we have to go beyond the step of just kind of voluntary employers coming to us asking for help, if we're really going to get a good sample size of every different type of industry.
We're in the final minute here, but Dr. Schor, I'll give you the last word either on that question or if you want to broaden out any final tips or wisdom.
I do think that's really key. And that's where the government role is so important, because I think if we just leave it to voluntary actions by employers, we're going to keep getting this skew toward the white collar. And, eventually we'll get enough manufacturing, construction, et cetera, firms, but right now it's a small number. Last thing I'll say is about that hourly wage increase. I just want to stress that because it's hard for a lot of people to wrap their heads around it. People think, oh, hourly workers are going to get hurt by this. The answer is no, they get a higher hourly wage. Now, hopefully they earn enough that they don't have to go and work somewhere else on that fifth day. But even if they did, they still are getting a pay increase. So yeah.
Well, this is wonderful. It's very exciting to see the beginning of a reopening of a policy space that was opened up at the turn of the last century and brought a lot of joy and progress to our country when it was last opened up. And it's about time we do it again. In the spirit of Richard Nixon, it might be, hopefully it's inevitable if we fight for it. Thank you, Delegate Stewart. Thank you, Dr. Schor. And I'm sure both of you are open to anyone reaching out to be excited for sharing resources and getting tips for their fight in their state. Thanks, everyone. Keep up the good fight. And everyone, please head back to the main stage for the closing. Back to the main stage for the closing. Thank you.